Well, today we're going to talk about climate science, and I'm delighted to have with me a special guest. Her name is Michelle Stirling, and she is a spokesperson for the Friends of Science. So, a warm welcome to you, Michelle.
Thank you so much for having me on the show, David.
Well, Michelle, it's great to have you. I've admired for years the incredible work by the team of scientists that you have the privilege of working with. Can you tell us quickly what are the Friends of Science?
Well, Friends of Science is a group of Earth atmospheric solar scientists and citizens um, who dispute the claim that human caused climate change is catastrophic in any way. And we hold the view that the sun is the main driver of climate change, not you and not carbon dioxide. Um, it's not a very broadly held view, but we try to get a more nuanced view out to the public by providing a lot of free information
Hmm.
in our newsletters.
Okay, so but to be clear, you're with a group of scientists who look at these issues carefully, and they are complex, and they are ones that we want to understand. So we really appreciate your kind of leadership. It's interesting. I recall well former U.S. President Barack Obama talking about there's a consensus on the science when it comes to climate concerns. Is that really true?
Um, there's a sort of consensus in that, yes, most scientists would agree that there has been some warming since the turn of the century, that humans probably had some role in it. But there's a lot of people who dispute the claim that CO2 from human caused emissions are the driver of that.
Okay.
And most people, in fact, if you look at the Clintel network of scientists and scholars out of the Netherlands, there are 2,000 scientists and scholars who say there's no climate emergency. And in the World Climate Declaration, they explain the natural variability
Hmm.
factors
Hmm.
that show us that we're fine.
Yeah, so it's kind of in retrospect, a kind of an absurd statement. I mean, we know that climate is always changing, but the degree, the question is to what degree, in what context. And I think there's another perspective, Michelle, and help me, but scientists doesn't work by consensus. It frankly explores different hypotheses and tries to test whether or not those hypotheses are correct. So the idea of consensus seems to be, frankly, anti science, isn't it?
Well, that's true. For instance, we have a video interview with Dr. Nir Shaviv who says science is not a democracy. Science is about evidence.
Yes, right.
And we also have a publication that we put together back in, I think it was 2014, which is about the social proof of global warming and the 97% consensus and about herd mentality. So that
Mm.
examines all the data of these claimed consensus reviews, and you'll find that there's no consensus just statistically.
Yeah, no, that's a very good insight, and it reminds me of. I think there was a political scientist and sociologist. I think his name was Janis, who talked about the dangers of groupthink. I mean, you don't make decisions kind of through kind of a social consensus, as you're alluding to. You have to really use critical thinking, and we need healthy debate more than ever. So that's part of the reason why I'm really excited about our conversation, because I think there's a real story to be told here. So I need your help then, Michelle, to talk about some statements, and if you can help me briefly respond to them. Like we've heard a lot about, well, let's just go through them rapid fire. We've got the statement by Al Gore talking recently about the oceans boiling. Is that true? Are the oceans boiling?
No, the oceans are not boiling. And the oceans are very complex and they're a very integral role in modulating the climate of the Earth, because there's this thing called the conveyor that moves hot and warm currents all around the Earth like a great
Hmm.
big snake, and it's
Hmm.
always on the move, changing up and down. And depending on how that conveyor belt moves heat to the surface, it does affect climate. But we can't control that.
Hmm. Yeah, no, it's very interesting. Um, sea levels, are they rising? I know I saw years ago a very famous article in Time magazine showing a UN official up to his waist deep in the waters, kind of like a staged photograph by I think it was the Maldives. But are sea levels rising?
Well, this is again, you see, climate is has to be nuanced. We have to discuss these things in broader terms. For instance, in some places, the land is subsiding. That looks like the sea is rising.
Mm-hmm.
In places like these tiny islands, we have an interview with Dr. John Harper, who is a former head of the Geological Survey of Canada, and he said these small islands are being battered by the sea all the time. So the edge looks, it's eroding. So that
Oh,
feels like the sea is rising. But
okay.
actually, many of these coral atolls are growing all the time and they're growing bigger. So, it's not a one note samba for any answer.
What about hurricanes? We hear a lot about hurricanes and so-called extreme weather events. Are there more of them, and are they more powerful these days?
No. And if you look at the trends have actually been going down for these extreme events. The thing that we do see is a lot more cell phone coverage. You know, even 50 years ago, we didn't have immediate coverage of extreme weather events. You might read about it in paper a couple of weeks or even a month later, but you wouldn't see it right on the news that night, the same day it happened. So the emotional impact is much greater. And certainly for the people involved, many of these events are horrific. The flooding in Valencia that just happened. But if you look at the historical record, Valencia's flooded like that quite a few times before.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. What about the ice caps? Are they shriveling up and melting away?
Well, there are two differentiations we must make between the polar ice caps. The Arctic ice cap is like a big ice cube floating around on a number of currents that flow in and out that are warm and cold.
Hmm.
And the Antarctica is a land based ice cap. So if there's melting in the Arctic, and this has happened before, this can be from the inflow of warm currents, that same conveyor belt and related ocean currents. But, it's not carbon dioxide that causes cold ice to melt. It's heat. Heat rises.
Mm.
Now, if you look at Antarctica, what's interesting is that um, there's a whole group of geothermal activity or like volcanoes under the ice. And it's a very active region on one side of Antarctica. Not to mention, they found by drilling way down, they found uh, an entire lake under the ice called Lake Vostok. So there are lots of things going on down there that, again, have nothing to do with you having a carbon tax.
Okay, well, so that's reassuring again. So I guess part of this is, and I don't mean to. I know these are quick questions, but they're often messages or part of a narrative that we hear that are really concerning. Because I think all of us care deeply about the environment, but it's almost like the narrative is one of a kind of a doomsday scenario where the Earth is headed for catastrophe. But that's not what you're saying, is it?
That's right. The Earth has been around a long time, and if you look at some of our Dr. Harper interviews or some of our past events that we have on our website, you'll see that these scientists are explaining how over, say, 600 million years, how we've gone from desertified situation to really a glaciation situation, and everything in between, tropical, temperate, and it goes in cycles that are not regular, but they are dramatic, and it just shows you how little control we humans have. There are things that we can do to help ourselves in terms of like an urban heat island. There are effective measures we could take to reduce the impacts of that locally. But, we can't stop climate change on Earth.
Okay. So then the whole idea that this is all human made and that if we just stop driving our car and driving a bike is going to make any difference is really kind of silly, isn't it?
It's ridiculous.
Okay.
Yes.
Wow. Well, it's certainly, I'm really looking forward to, understanding better the science. And speaking of science here, a lot of this seems to boil down to a gas called carbon dioxide. So is carbon dioxide really a pollutant? I guess the last time I checked, I mean, I visited a friend at his greenhouse and he's pumping carbon dioxide into the greenhouse so that they can better flourish. So I thought carbon dioxide was integral part of the life cycle of everything that we see.
It is, and we're carbon beings, but carbon dioxide is not even registered as a pollutant at the federal level. So, and it's often confused with carbon monoxide, which is poisonous and toxic. And of course, in vast quantities, carbon dioxide does have a negative effect on humans, but nothing at the level that we're at now. I mean, even when you're in a conference room, the parts per million are probably 1,500 or so, and yet people are freaking out about 400 parts per million, and oh my gosh, we're going to warm the planet more than 1 or 2 degrees. Well, most places on Earth vary during the day about 15 degrees.
Hmm.
So, a couple more degrees will not hurt us, and it's not driven by carbon dioxide. And furthermore, the astrobiologists who are looking for other planets out there in the cosmos where we might be able to live one day, they look for a planet that is 5 degrees Celsius warmer than Earth.
Oh, go figure. I did not know this, Michelle. So it's always fascinating to talk with you about this background. Are we talking about the use of fear to drive forward different public policies that under normal circumstances people wouldn't accept? Is that part of what's going on here, Michelle?
Well, I would say that certainly has become the norm within the climate community. There's a very good report that Dr. Tammy Nemeth wrote for the Alberta Inquiry that details the vast scope of the global progressive movement. And, these are people who want to dismantle conventional Western civilization and start over again with something new. And so, that's one very active angle. There's a group of people who are Malthusian in nature, the overshoot community. They believe that we're totally overpopulated and the world would do better with far fewer people, which, that leads to very dangerous public policy, as we saw in pre-World War Weimar German Republic.
Wow.
And that's where they got rid of useless eaters. And people are proposing things like that now to try and reduce your carbon footprint in the UK. The National Health Service has a net zero public policy for the health service, and there are papers being issued where it's called Geriatrics in a Time of Climate Change, where they're actually measuring the carbon footprint of a frail person against the national carbon footprint.
Wow. So let me understand then. So you're saying there's a lot of different motivations for people advocating this kind of fear narrative. So they can introduce public policies for different reasons. You mentioned the so-called Malthusians. I guess these are people that think that we just have too many darn people on this planet and we can't accommodate them. So the key is ultimately to reduce the population number. So there's actually people like that still out and about. Is that right?
Yeah, there's a lot of them. And in fact, actually, we hadn't talked about this before, but there's a group out of Montreal called the Last Generation. They're kind of like the Just Stop Oil kids. And they have been climbing all over trellises and blocking access to airports. And some of them are in jail now. Some are going on a hunger strike, but they're driven by a paper which suggests that for every ton of carbon dioxide, X number of people die, and therefore we have to stop using oil. In fact, if you look at the historical record, longevity, modern medicine, freedom of mobility like travel and such like have all increased dramatically thanks to the fact that we have the energy and the byproducts of fossil fuels. But these kids are literally scared to death. They literally think that they are the last generation on Earth.
Wow. That's kind of
That's a
sad.
tragedy.
It really is a tragedy.
Without open discussion and debate, you're not thinking, nor are you free. Comment below. We'd love for you to join the conversation.